The plate shattered against the wall 6 inches from her head, and she did not flinch. She just bent down, picked up the pieces one by one, and kept her eyes on the floor. That was the rule. You did not look at him when he was angry, and he was angry most nights. For 3 years she had swallowed the shouting, the shoving, the coffee thrown in her face when an order came out wrong. 3 years of bruises she hid under long sleeves in the middle of summer. Her name was Delia, and everyone in that little town figured she was just a woman with nowhere else to go. But what nobody knew, not her boss, not the regulars, not the man who hit her, was who her own family really was. What happens when the wrong man walks through that door? Stay with me on this one. The diner sat at the edge of a town called Two Rivers, right where the state highway bent away toward the mountains. It was one of those places you have driven past 100 times without ever stopping. A long, low building with a gravel lot, a faded sign that said "Eat," and a red neon coffee cup in the window that had not worked right since before Delia got there. Inside, it smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee, and the pink soap they used to mop the floors. Truckers stopped in. Farmers. A few old men who had nowhere better to be. And it belonged, every square inch of it, to a man named Roy Deacon. Now let me tell you about Roy. Because you need to understand him before any of this makes sense. Roy was a big man, and he had been a strong man once, back when he played ball in high school, back when people in town still thought he might amount to something. But that was 30 years gone. What was left of Roy was a heavy belly, a red face, and a temper that got worse every year the money got tighter. He owned the diner outright. He owned the little house behind it. And in his mind, when he hired you, he owned a piece of you too. I want you to picture Roy on a good day, because that is somehow the saddest part. On a good day, Roy would come in whistling. He would flip on the grill and crack a joke with the truckers and call the farmers by name and slap a man on the back, and a stranger walking in would think, now there is a fine fellow, a real salt-of-the-earth type, running a little diner out here at the edge of nowhere. That was the Roy the town wanted to believe in. That was the Roy they told themselves was the real one. And the other Roy, the one who split lips in the back room, that one was just a bad mood, just the pressure of the business, just a man having a hard time. People are very good at deciding that the kind face is the true face, and the cruel face is the accident. It is almost always the other way around. The cruelty is the man. The kindness is the mask he wears in front of witnesses. Delia came to Two Rivers with one suitcase, and a car that died in the lot 2 weeks later and never started again. She did not talk much about where she came from. People asked at first, the way people in small towns do. She would smile a little and say something about being from back east and change the subject, and after a while folks stopped asking. She was quiet. She was polite. She was the kind of woman who thanked you for holding a door and remembered how you took your eggs. And Roy Deacon looked at all of that and saw something he could use. The first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a mark, it was over a mixed-up ticket. 2 eggs instead of 3. She dropped a plate in surprise, and it broke, and Roy told her the cost was coming out of her pay. Then he squeezed her arm and told her to be more careful, and he squeezed it a little longer than he needed to, just to see what she would do. She did not do anything. And that told Roy everything he needed to know. Here is the thing about a bully. A real one, I mean. He is not looking for a fight. He is looking for someone who will not fight back. He tests you, little by little, and if you let the small things go, he takes bigger things. Roy took and took. First it was the yelling. Then it was the shoving. Then it was docking her pay for things that were not her fault, until some weeks she walked out of there with almost nothing. He gave her the worst shift, the double shifts, the holidays. He rented her the little room over the storage part of the building and charged her most of what she earned to live in it, so she could never quite get ahead, never quite save enough to leave. And that was the whole point. Believe me. He built her a cage out of nothing but small cruelties, and he made sure the door was always just barely too heavy to push open. And he was smart about it, in the low animal way that men like that are smart. He never marked her face where a customer might see, not in the early days. He kept it to the arms, the shoulders, the ribs, the places a long sleeve covers. He never yelled the worst things where a full room could hear. He waited for the lull, the dead hour, the empty diner. He kept two Roys, the one for the daylight and the one for the shadows, and he moved between them so smoothly that even Delia, some days, could half convince herself she had imagined the shadow one. That is what long cruelty does. It does not just hurt you. It makes you doubt your own eyes. Why did she stay? I know that is the question sitting in your chest right now. It is the question everybody asks about a woman like Delia, and usually the people asking it have never been where she was. She stayed because the car was dead and the bank account was empty. She stayed because winter comes early up in that country, and a room over a diner is warmer than a car. She stayed because when you have been told every single day that you are worthless, slow, lucky anyone would keep you at all, you start to halfway believe it. And she stayed because of one more thing, a thing she kept folded up small and private inside her, and we will get to that. Just hold on to it. The regulars saw it. That is the part that ought to bother you, and it should. Old Walt saw it, the farmer who came in every morning for coffee and dry toast. The two truckers who ran the gravel route saw it. They saw the marks on her arms in the summer. They heard Roy call her names that no man should call a woman, right there in front of God and everybody, and they looked down into their coffee cups, and they did not say one word. Because Roy was a big man, and it was his diner, and it was easier to look away. That is how these things go on for 3 years. Not because nobody sees. Because everybody sees, and everybody decides it is not their problem. I want to stop on that a second, because it matters for later. There was a moment, in Delia's second year, when it almost came out into the open. A woman passing through, a stranger, a lawyer's wife on her way to the coast, sat in a booth and watched Roy grab Delia by the hair and yank her head back over some nothing, some water glass with a lip stain on it, and the woman stood up and said, loud, "You do not put your hands on her like that." And the whole diner went quiet. And here is the thing that will make you sick. Roy smiled. Roy turned on the daylight face, easy as flipping a switch, and he said, "Ma'am, we're just playing around, ain't we, Dell?" And every eye in that room turned to Delia. And Delia, who knew exactly what would happen in the back room the second that stranger drove off, Delia looked at the floor and said, "We're just playing." And the woman sat back down, uncertain now, second-guessing what her own eyes had plainly seen, and she left a big tip and drove away. and she probably tells that story to this day as a strange little thing she once misread. She did not misread it. Delia protected Roy because Delia knew the price of not protecting Roy. That is the trap all the way down. He made her guard her own cage. Delia had a way of getting through a day. She broke it into pieces so small she could carry them. Get through the breakfast rush. Get through the lull. Get the truckers their lunch. Wipe the counter. Refill the ketchup bottles, which she did with a steadiness that was almost peaceful, funneling one bottle into the next, lining them up like little soldiers. She found calm in the small tasks. She was good at her job, better than Roy deserved, and the customers knew it. She remembered their names and their kids' names, and that Walt liked his toast almost burnt. In a life where almost everything had been taken from her, being good at pouring coffee was a thing that was still hers. Roy could not take that. So he hated it. Now I have to tell you about June, because June is where the story starts to turn, even though nobody knew it yet, least of all June. June was 19. She showed up in Two Rivers late that second winter, the way Delia had shown up, with a bad boyfriend somewhere behind her and a duffel bag and about $40. Roy hired her as a second girl, part-time, dish and bus, because business had a little bump that year and one waitress could not turn the tables fast enough on a Friday. And Roy looked at June the way he had once looked at Delia and started running the same play. The little tests. The squeezed arm. The docked pay. June was younger and greener and more scared than Delia had ever let herself look, and Roy could smell it on her like a dog smells fear. And something happened in Delia that surprised even Delia. She could take it herself. She had made a whole architecture out of taking it herself, a set of rooms in her head she could go into and lock the door. But she could not stand to watch it start on June. The first time Roy grabbed that girl by the back of the neck, Delia stepped in. Not loud. Not a scene. She just moved between them with a coffee pot in her hand and said, "Easy. Roy, I got her. She's still learning that one's on me." And she took the blame for the broken glass or the wrong ticket or whatever it was, took it onto her own account. And Roy, who preferred the sure thing to the new thing, let it go, and turned his weight back onto Delia where it had always sat comfortable. She did that again and again all that winter. She stood between Roy and June like a wall. When Roy wanted to dock June's pay, Delia quietly slipped the girl cash out of her own thin envelope. When Roy put June on a double, Delia traded her out of it and took it herself. She taught June the trick of the small pieces, get through the rush, get through the lull, and she taught her the other trick too, the one that hurt to teach, which was how to look at the floor and make yourself small enough that the storm passes over you instead of through you. And late one night, closing up, June looked at Delia with those scared young eyes and said, "Why do you do that?" "Take it for me." And Delia was quiet a long time, wiping down a table that was already clean. And then she said, "Because somebody told me a long time ago that you don't leave people alone in it." I forgot that for a while. I'm trying to remember. June did not understand what she meant. Neither quite did Delia. But the remembering had started. Hold on to that too. It matters. June didn't last the winter. Her bad boyfriend came back around, sorry and sweet the way they always are for exactly as long as it takes, and she went off with him one gray morning without saying goodbye, and Delia stood in the lot and watched the taillights and felt something she had not let herself feel in years, which was grief for somebody else. And Roy, watching from the window, said the cruelest thing he had said yet. He said, "Guess it takes one to know one, huh? You two peas in a pod." And he laughed. And Delia went back inside and lined up the ketchup bottles, and for the first time in a long time, under the numbness, way down at the bottom of her, something was not numb. Something was angry. She did not have a name for it yet. But it had woken up. There was a night, late in that third year, that I want to tell you about, because it shows you exactly where things stood before everything changed. It was near closing. The place was empty, except for one trucker finishing his pie. Delia was cashing out the register, counting the day's money into the little zip bag Roy made her fill every night. And Roy came out of the back, and he had been drinking, which he did more and more, and he looked at the bag and decided it was light. It was not light. It was exactly right. Delia counted it twice. But Roy decided it was light, and he decided she had taken from it, and he came around that counter with his face gone that ugly shade of red. She backed up against the pie case. She said quiet, "Roy, it's all there, I counted it." And he did not care. He was not really angry about the money. The money was just the excuse. He grabbed the front of her uniform and he lifted her half off her feet and he said things I will not repeat, and the trucker at the counter stood up like he might do something, and Roy turned that red face on him and said, "You got a problem. You can pay your check and get out." And the trucker looked at Delia, and Delia looked at the floor and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't." And the trucker sat back down. And Roy let her go, and she slid down the pie case to the floor, and he told her to clean herself up. They opened at 6. That was Delia's life. Now here is the thing you have to understand. She was not weak. I know it looks like weak from the outside. But there is a difference between weak and waiting. There is a difference between a woman who has given up and a woman who is simply very, very far from home, holding onto one last thread, believing against all the evidence that someday that thread was going to pull tight. Delia was the second kind. And that folded-up private thing she kept inside her, the thing that got her through, was a name. A name she had not spoken out loud in a long time. A phone number written on a scrap of paper, soft as cloth now from being carried, that she kept in the lining of her wallet and never called, because calling it meant admitting how bad things had gotten, and she was not ready. Not yet. So the days went by. Roy got meaner. The neon coffee cup flickered in the window. The bruises came and went and came again. And nobody in Two Rivers, nobody at all, had the first idea that the quiet waitress refilling the ketchup bottles came from a family of men who did not, under any circumstances, look away. The winter that year was hard. The kind of cold that gets into the walls of a place like that diner and never leaves. Business got slow, the way it always did when the roads iced over and the truckers took the interstate instead of the state route. And when business got slow, Roy got worse, because now on top of being a bully, he was a scared bully, watching his money dry up, and a scared bully is the most dangerous kind there is. He started keeping the diner open later, hoping to catch the night drivers, which meant Delia worked later. He started cutting corners on everything, buying the cheapest food, watering down the coffee, and when a customer complained, which they did, he blamed Delia. He would apologize to the customer, all smiles, and then in the back he would take it out on her. A grab. A shove into the shelving. Once that winter, a slap across the face so hard it split her lip, over a steak a trucker sent back for being overcooked. A steak Roy had cooked himself. She stood there with blood on her mouth and she said nothing, and she went back out and smiled at the next table and asked if they were ready to order. Old Walt came in one morning, brushing snow off his coat, and he saw the split lip, half-healed, and he stopped in the doorway. He was maybe 70, a widower, hands like tree roots from a life on the tractor. And for a second Delia thought, this is the morning somebody finally says something. Walt looked at her, and looked toward the kitchen where Roy was banging pans around, and his jaw worked. And then he sat down at his usual stool and said, "Quiet, coffee, hun. Toast almost burnt." And Delia said, "You got it, Walt," and something passed between them, something like shame on his side and forgiveness on hers, and that was all. That was as far as anybody in that town was willing to go. But Walt, I want you to know, did not sleep that night. That is a thing I found out later, and it changes how you see him. Walt went home to his empty farmhouse and he sat at the kitchen table where his wife used to sit, and he thought about that split lip, and he thought about his own daughter, grown and gone to the city years ago, and he thought about all the mornings he had said coffee and toast and looked at the floor. And he took out a piece of paper and a pen, because Walt was an old man who did not trust telephones, and he started to write a letter to the county sheriff 2 towns over. He got 3 lines in. And then he thought about what Roy would do to Delia if a sheriff came asking questions and then drove away again, the way that lawyer's wife had driven away, leaving her behind to pay the bill. And Walt, God help him, put the pen down, because he could not see a way to help her that did not end with him going home safe and her staying behind with Roy. He did not have the shape of a rescue in his head. He only had the shape of getting her hurt worse. So he did nothing, and he hated himself for it, and he came in the next morning for coffee and toast because it was the only way he knew to sit with her a while and let her know, in the only language he had, that somebody saw. Remember Walt. He comes back around. Something was coming. It had been coming for a long time, slow, from a long way off, the way a heavy truck comes up a mountain grade. You cannot see it yet. But if you put your hand flat on the ground, you can feel it. And that winter, without knowing it, without a soul in Two Rivers knowing it, Delia was about 3 weeks away from the morning that thread finally pulled tight. It started with a phone call, though not the one you are thinking of. Not yet. It started with Roy's phone ringing in the back one afternoon, and Roy's voice going low and careful the way it did when he owed somebody money. Because Roy owed a lot of people money by then. And one of the people he owed was not the kind of man who sent a polite letter. Delia only caught pieces of it through the pass-through window. Roy saying, "I know. I know. I'm good for it." Roy saying, "Give me till the end of the month." Roy saying, "There's no need for anybody to come out here." And then Roy hung up, and he stood very still in the back for a minute, and when he came out his face was not red. It was white. And a white-faced Roy was something Delia had never seen. She did not know what it meant. But she knew, the way you know weather, that the pressure in that building had just changed. And she wiped down the counter, and she lined up the ketchup bottles, and she told herself the same thing she told herself every night. Get through today. Just get through today. And for a few more days, that quiet held. It was almost peaceful. It was the last peaceful stretch she would get for a while. In those few days, Roy did a strange thing. He got quiet. Not kind, never that, but quiet, turned inward, like a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. He stopped drinking as much. He stood at the window a lot, looking down the highway both directions like he was expecting somebody. Once, Delia found him in the back with the account book spread out and his head in his hands, and for 1 weak instant she felt something close to pity, because there is a part of a decent person that cannot help feeling for a drowning man, even when the drowning man is the one who has been holding your head under water for 3 years. And then Roy looked up and saw her seeing him, and he was so ashamed of being seen weak that he threw the coffee pot at her, and it missed and shattered, and any pity she had went out of her like a snuffed candle. Good. She would need it gone for what was coming. The thing that broke it walked in on a Tuesday, in the person of 2 men Delia had never seen before. They came in around 3 in the afternoon, the dead hour, when the diner was empty and the light through the windows had gone gray and flat. They did not look like truckers. They did not look like farmers. They wore good coats and hard shoes, and they sat down in the corner booth without looking at the menu, and one of them said, "Tell Roy that Mr. Castellano's people are here." And that is the moment everything about this story changed. Because up until then, you understand, this was one man being cruel to one woman. That is a terrible thing, but it is a simple thing. What walked in that door on Tuesday made it something else. Roy Deacon was not just a small-town bully with a bad temper. Roy Deacon was a man drowning in debt to people who broke bones for a living. And the diner, the little house, the room over the storage, all of it was collateral. And Delia, whether she knew it or not, was standing inside the thing these men had come to collect. Roy came out of the back and saw them, and went that white color again. He sent Delia to the storeroom. Actually sent her, hissed at her to go count the canned goods and not come out till he said, and she went, because you did what Roy said. But the storeroom shared a wall with the corner booth, thin as paper, and Delia stood in the dark among the number 10 cans, and she heard the whole thing. She heard that Roy owed $60,000. She heard that the interest on it was more than the diner cleared in a good month. She heard one of the men say, in a voice with no heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than shouting, that Mr. Castellano was a patient man, but that patience had a price, and the price had come due. And she heard them lay it out plain. Roy was going to sign the diner over. All of it. The building, the land, the little house. And Roy could stay on and run it, they said, generous as you please as an employee. He would work in his own diner for wages, and the wages would go to Mr. Castellano until the debt was clear, which, the way they figured the interest, would be somewhere around never. And then one of the men said the thing that made Delia's blood go cold in that dark storeroom. He said, and the girl. Castellano saw the books. He knows you got a girl living here works for almost nothing. That's a good arrangement. That stays. Like she was a fixture. Like she came with the building, same as the grill and the pie case. Roy did not argue. Roy did not say one word in her defense. Roy said, yeah. Sure. Whatever you need. And in the dark, holding a can of green beans, Delia understood that she had not been trapped by one man's cruelty at all. She had been standing, this whole time, inside something much bigger, with more men in it. And now those men had counted her up like inventory and decided she stayed. There was more, and this is the part that turned the cold in her belly into something hot. Before they left, the quiet one, the one who never raised his voice, said, "Castellano heard you had a second girl for a while. Young one. What happened to her?" And Roy said the girl ran off. And the man said, "Shame. He likes to know what's on the property. You get another one, another young one comes through looking for work, you tell us. He likes to keep a full inventory." And they got up and they buttoned their good coats and they walked out into the gray afternoon. And Delia stood in the dark and thought about June, 19 years old, $40 in her pocket. And she thought about the next June, and the one after that, and she understood that whatever this diner was about to become, it was going to be a machine for eating scared young women, one after another forever, and Roy was going to run it. And every girl who walked in that door with a duffel bag was going to disappear into it. That was the thought that did it. Not what they would do to her. What they would do to the ones who came after. That was the night she took the scrap of paper out of the lining of her wallet. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room over the storage, with the wind pushing at the window, and she unfolded it. The number was worn, but you could still read it. And under it, in her own handwriting from years ago, one word. A name. Not a first name. A road name. The kind of name a man earns and does not give back. She sat there a long time with her thumb on those numbers. Because here is what you have to understand about Delia, and about why she never called before. Calling that number was not asking for help. Calling that number was pulling a pin. The men who would answer that call did not do things halfway, did not do things quietly, did not, once they started, stop. She had spent 3 years telling herself it was not bad enough yet, that she could handle it, that she did not want to bring that down on this place. But that was before 2 men in good coats sat in the corner booth and added her to a list of property. That was before they asked about the next young girl. If you have ever been where Delia was, you know that a person can take an awful lot when it is only being done to them. It is a strange thing about the human heart. She had absorbed 3 years of Roy on her own account and told herself she deserved it, or that it did not matter, or that tomorrow would be better. But the moment she understood she was being handed off, sold along with the furniture, and worse, the moment she understood there would be others, something in her that had been asleep for a long time opened one eye. And it was not fear. Fear she knew. This was the other thing. This was the family thing. This was the thing that ran in her blood from a father she had loved and buried, and it woke up in that cold little room and it said, enough. She dialed the number. It was late past midnight. It rang twice. And a man's voice, rough with sleep and years and cigarettes, said one word. Yeah. And Delia opened her mouth, and for a second nothing came out, 3 years of silence stuck in her throat. And then she said, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, small and cracked and shaking, "Uncle Bear." "It's me. It's Dell." And there was a silence on the other end of that line. A long one. The kind of silence a man makes when the ground has just shifted under him. And then that rough voice, wide awake now, every trace of sleep gone out of it, said, "Baby girl, where are you? Tell me where you are. If you are still with me, if this story has its hand on you the way it had its hand on me when I first heard it, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next is the part I have been wanting to tell you since the first word. Now I need to take you back. Just for a minute. Because you cannot understand the man on the other end of that phone unless you understand who Delia's father was. And I promised you a folded-up thing, and this is it. Delia's father was a Hell's Angel. Not a hanger-on, not a weekend rider, not a man who bought the jacket. He was a patched member of a chapter back east for over 20 years, and the men he rode with were not his friends. They were his brothers, in the deep and literal way that word gets used in that world. His road name was Cannon. And the man Delia grew up calling Uncle Bear was not her blood uncle at all. He was the chapter president. He was the man her father pulled out of a burning wreck on a rain-slick highway one night in 1991, dragged clear by the back of his cut with the gas already going up, and the two of them lay in the ditch and watched the bike burn, and from that night on there was nothing one would not do for the other. That is a debt that does not get paid off. That is a debt that gets passed down. I want you to know what her childhood was actually like, because the word Hell's Angel puts a picture in your head, and the picture is probably wrong. Yes, there was noise, and there were men who looked like they had walked out of your worst idea of a back alley. But there was also this. When Delia was 7 and her mother left, it was Bear who showed up the next morning with a box of donuts and sat on the porch with her all day so her father could grieve without her watching. When she was 11 and a teacher humiliated her in front of the class, 4 enormous men in leather showed up to parent-teacher night and sat in the little plastic chairs with their knees up around their ears and were unfailingly, terrifyingly polite. And that teacher never so much as raised her voice at Delia again. When she was 14 and a boy put his hands on her at a fair, that boy found his father's truck up on blocks the next morning with every lug nut in the county apparently missing, and no law could ever prove a thing, and the boy moved away that summer. She grew up inside a wall of men who had decided, collectively and permanently, that nothing was going to touch Cannon's girl. She grew up safe in a way most people never know a day of. And then it all went away. Delia's father died when she was 19. Not in some blaze of glory. He died in a hospital bed of the cancer, thin as a rail, holding her hand. And at that bedside, with the machines beeping, Bear leaned down and made her father a promise. He said, "Your girl is my girl now. Anything she ever needs, any hour of any day, she calls me and I come. I don't care where she is. I don't care what it is. I come." And Delia's father squeezed his hand and closed his eyes and let go, believing it because he knew Bear, and Bear did not break a promise. Never. But grief does strange things to people. After the funeral, Delia ran. Not from Bear. From all of it. From the noise and the weight and the memory and the whole loud world her father had lived in, because every rumble of a pipe sounded like him, and she could not stand it. She wanted to be nobody, somewhere quiet where nothing reminded her. She wanted to be small. And so she drifted west, town by town, job by job, getting smaller and quieter, until she washed up in 2 rivers with a dead car and a bad man, and she carried Bear's number in her wallet like a life preserver she was too proud, too broken, too ashamed to ever actually use. Until now. Until she got counted up like inventory. Until enough finally meant enough. And here is the terrible irony of it, the thing that will break your heart if you let it. She had spent 3 years believing she was alone in the world. She was never alone. Not for one single day of it. There was, the whole time, a phone that would ring twice and a man who would come. An entire brotherhood who had sworn an oath over a dying man, sitting 1,000 miles east, not knowing she needed them, waiting only to be called. The wall around her had never come down. She had just walked away from it and forgotten it was there. Everything she suffered inside arm's reach of rescue, and the only thing keeping the rescue away was her own silence. Sit with that a second. Because somebody watching this right now is doing the exact same thing. When she hung up that phone, she told Bear where she was. She told him the name of the town and the name of the diner, and because he made her, in that voice that would not be argued with, she told him the rest. 3 years of it. The arm. The lip. The plate against the wall. The coffee in the face. She told him about June, too, and about the men in the good coats and what they had said about keeping a full inventory. And she heard, on the other end of the line, a sound like a man breathing very slowly and very deliberately to keep from breaking something. And when she was done, Bear did not yell. That is the thing people get wrong about men like Bear. He did not yell. He said quiet, "Okay. Okay, baby girl. I want you to do exactly what you've been doing. Go to work. Smile at the mean son of a bitch. Pour the coffee. Don't let on nothing changed. Can you do that for me? 2 more days." And Delia said yes. And Bear said, 2 more days, Del. And then you never pour that man another cup of coffee as long as you live. And the line went dead. What Delia did not hear, because she was 1,000 miles away in a cold little room, was what happened on Bear's end after he hung up. I will tell you, because it is the kind of thing that ought to be told. Bear sat on the edge of his own bed for a minute in the dark. And then he got up, and he made 2 phone calls, and inside of an hour there were men awake all over 3 states. There was a fellow who knew things about other men making quiet inquiries into exactly who and what Mr. Castellano was. There was a road captain pulling maps. There was a lawyer, a real one, an old brother's son who had gone straight and gone to law school, being woken up and told to draw up papers and be ready to drive. Bear did not plan a beating. Any fool can plan a beating. Bear planned a whole operation, a clean one, the kind that leaves the bad man ruined and the law with nothing to hold, and he planned it in the dark in about an hour, because he had been doing this a very long time, and because Cannon's girl had finally called. And then, only then, when the machine was moving, he let himself feel the thing he had been holding down, and he sat in the dark a while longer with his fists on his knees, and if you had seen his face, you would not have wanted to be Roy Deacon. 2 days. Now, I want you to sit inside those 2 days with Delia, because they were the strangest 2 days of her whole life. Because for the first time in 3 years, she had a secret that was hers, and it was bigger than any secret Roy had. She got up at 5:30 like always. She went down and started the coffee. She flipped the sign to open. Walt came in and she burned his toast just right. The Castellano men did not come back, but Roy was jumpy as a cat, on the phone in the back, and twice he snapped at her, and once he shoved her into the counter, and here is what was different. It did not touch her. It went right through her like she was made of air. Because she knew. She knew what was coming up that mountain grade, and Roy did not. And there is a kind of power in that, a quiet, enormous power, and she held it under her apron, and she poured the coffee, and she waited. I want to give you one small moment from those 2 days, because it is my favorite and it is true. On the first evening, closing up, Delia was wiping down the corner booth, the Castellano booth, and Walt was still on his stool, lingering the way lonely old men linger. And out of nowhere, without deciding to, Delia said, "Walt, you ever have somebody you were sure was gone for good, and then they weren't?" And Walt, who thought about his dead wife every hour of every day, went very still. And he said, "Every morning of my life, hun." And Delia nodded, and she almost told him. She got right up to the edge of it. She wanted so badly to say, "Somebody's coming, Walt. Somebody's finally coming. It's going to be all right." But she remembered Bear's voice. Don't let on nothing changed, and she swallowed it, and she just said, "Well, sometimes they come back." And Walt looked at her funny, because there was something lit up in her face that had not been there in 3 years, and he could not name it, and he went home puzzling over it. He would understand soon enough. On the second day, the weather turned. Warm wind came up from the south and started eating the snow, and the roads cleared, and the run of the highway changed its sound. And along about the middle of the afternoon, that dead gray hour when the diner was empty, Delia was refilling the ketchup bottles, funneling one into the other, lining them up in a neat little row, when she heard it. Way off. Under the wind. A sound she had spent her whole childhood falling asleep to. A sound she had run 1,000 miles to get away from and had missed, God help her, every single day. Thunder with no clouds. The low rolling thunder of engines. A lot of them. Roy heard it too. He came out of the back wiping his hands on a rag, frowning, going to the window. And the sound got bigger. It came up the state highway, and it did not fade the way traffic fades. It grew. It filled the whole valley until the glass in the windows buzzed with it, and the coffee trembled in the pot. And Delia set down the ketchup bottle she was holding, and she wiped her hands very slowly on her apron, and she turned to face the door. And for the first time in 3 years in that diner, the quiet waitress from back east stood up straight, all the way straight, and lifted her chin. They came into the gravel lot in a long line, one after another, headlights on in the gray afternoon, and they filled it, and they kept coming, until there were more motorcycles in that lot than there had ever been cars, and the engines all shut down at once, and the silence after was the loudest thing you ever heard. Roy stood frozen at the window with the rag in his hands. And through the glass, he watched the men swing off those machines. Big men. Older men, most of them gray in their beards, arms like Walt's from a hard life, and on the back of every single leather cut, the same patch, the same wings, the same name of a chapter a long way from 2 rivers. And Roy Deacon, who had never in his life been afraid of anything smaller than the Castellanos, felt his stomach drop straight through the floor. One man walked ahead of the rest. He was not the biggest, but you knew, the way animals know, that he was the one. broad through the shoulders, a gray beard down his chest, a face like weather-beat rock, and eyes that had seen every single thing there is to see and had stopped being surprised by any of it a long time ago. He came across that gravel lot slow, in no hurry at all, because men like that are never in a hurry. Hurry is for people who are afraid, and he had not been afraid since 1991. He came up the 2 steps, and he pulled open the door of Roy Deacon's diner, and the little bell over it rang, bright and stupid and cheerful, and Bear walked in. He did not look at Roy. Not at first. That was the thing. He walked in, and the whole club filed in behind him and filled that diner wall to wall, standing, not sitting, silent, and Bear's eyes went straight past Roy like Roy was a coat rack and found Delia. And his hard old face did a thing it had not done in years. It came apart just for a second, into something soft and wrecked and glad. And he said in that rough, quiet voice, "There she is. There's Cannon's girl." And Delia's chin held for one more second, held all the way through 3 years of holding, and then it crumpled, and she came around that counter and across that floor, and Bear caught her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all. And this enormous man in his leather cut stood in the middle of a greasy diner and held a crying waitress and rocked her side to side and murmured into her hair, "I got you. I got you now, baby girl. I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm here." And into that, of all people, walked Walt. He had come for his afternoon coffee, and he had seen the lot full of motorcycles, and he had almost turned around and gone home. And then he had thought about Delia in there alone with all of that. And old as he was, scared as he was, he had made himself come in because he had decided, somewhere in the last 3 years of coffee and toast and looking at the floor, that he was not going to leave her alone one more time. He came through the door with his hat in his hands and his heart going, ready to stand between Delia and 30 strangers if that was what it took, an old farmer with tree-root hands and nothing else. And what he found was Delia being held like something precious and weeping like something finally set down. And Walt stopped, and he understood all at once, everything, and his old eyes filled up, and he pressed his hat to his chest and stood by the door and let it happen. That is Walt's redemption, right there, small as it is. He came in. At the very end, when it counted, the old man came in. Now Roy. Roy was still standing by the window. And a smarter man, a better man, would have stayed very quiet and very still and let the moment be about the woman. But Roy Deacon had spent 30 years being the biggest, meanest thing in every room he walked into, and some part of his brain, the stupid part, the part that had thrown a plate at that woman's head, could not process that the ground had shifted. So Roy, God help him, Roy cleared his throat and said, "Hey. Hey, whatever this is my place and she's on the clock. Del, get back behind that counter, we got." And Bear went still. He set Delia down, gentle, and he turned around, slow, and for the first time he looked at Roy Deacon. He looked at him the way you look at something you found on the bottom of your boot. And the whole diner went so quiet you could hear the coffee maker tick. And Bear said, in a voice barely above a whisper, which somehow carried into every corner of that room, "You're the one." Roy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You're the one," Bear said again, and he took a step, who put his hands on this girl. He took another step. For 3 years. Another. This girl. You know whose girl this is. He was close now, close enough that Roy had to look up at him, and Roy had never in his life had to look up at anybody. Her daddy, Bear said, was a better man than you will ever meet if you live to be 100. Her daddy pulled me out of a fire, and I stood at his deathbed, and I gave him my word that anybody, anywhere, ever laid a hand on his little girl, I would come. And here I am. And Bear tilted his head, almost curious, almost gentle, and he said, "You threw a plate at her head." She told me on the phone. 6 inches from her head. That right? And Roy, sweating now, backed up against the pie case, the very same pie case he had thrown her against, and he stammered out that it was a misunderstanding, that she was a good worker, that he never meant nothing by it, that things got heated sometimes in the restaurant business. And Bear listened to all of it with his head tilted, patient. And when Roy ran out of words, Bear said, "See, here's what's gonna happen." And he laid it out, calm as a man reading a grocery list, and it was a beautiful thing to hear, and I am going to tell you every word. But first, understand something. The men in that room could have torn Roy Deacon to pieces. There were 30 of them, and there was one of him, and every one of them had heard, on the ride out, exactly what he had done, and every one of them had a daughter or a sister or a mother of their own, and their blood was up. Roy could feel it. Roy was waiting for the first fist. That is how Roy's whole life had worked. The biggest fist wins. And what Bear did instead was worse than any beating, and smarter, and it is the reason I love this story. Bear did not hit him. Bear said, "You're gonna sit down." And Roy sat, right there in the corner booth, the Castellano's booth, and Bear sat across from him, and folded his big scarred hands on the table like they were about to talk business, which they were. "Now," Bear said, "you got money troubles. Dell told me about your visitors. Fella named Castellano." And Roy's white face went a shade whiter, because how did he? And Bear smiled without any warmth at all and said, "Son, we know Castellano. We know everybody like Castellano. You want to hear something funny? Castellano owes us a courtesy. Little thing from a few years back. And I already made a call. He let that sit. Your debt to him. That's handled. Paid. Gone. As of an hour ago." Roy blinked, not understanding. "You don't owe Castellano one thin dime." Bear said, "You owe me now. Every cent of it. 60 grand. And you're gonna pay it exactly the way those animals wanted you to pay him. You're gonna sign this diner over." He nodded, and one of the men by the door stepped forward and set a folder on the table, and behind him came a younger fellow in a good shirt with a briefcase, the lawyer, the old brother's son, who had driven through the night. Real papers. Filed right. They had come ready. Because Bear did not do things halfway. "You're gonna sign it over," Bear said to her. And he nodded at Delia. "The building. The land. That little house. That room upstairs you charged her rent to live in, that you docked out of her pay. I know about that too. All of it. Hers. And then you're gonna do the one thing in your whole miserable life that resembles a decent act. You're gonna walk out that door, and you're gonna get in your truck, and you are never, ever going to come back to this town. Because if you do," and here Bear leaned in, and dropped his voice so low that Roy had to lean in to hear it. And whatever he said, nobody else in that room ever heard it. But Roy Deacon went the color of old paper and did not stop shaking. And Roy signed. Of course he signed. His hand shook so bad he could barely hold the pen, and the young lawyer turned the pages and pointed, quiet and professional, initial here, sign here, date here. And Roy signed every place the thick finger tapped. And when it was done, Bear gathered up the folder and stood, and Roy stood too, fast, eager to be gone, and he made it 3 steps toward the door before Bear said, "Roy." And Roy stopped. And Bear said, "You forgot something." And Roy turned around, terrified, and Bear was holding out a single dollar bill. "Your last paycheck," Bear said. "You worked here today. Fair's fair." And it was the cruelest kind thing you ever saw, handing that man $1 in the diner he used to own, in front of the woman he used to beat. And Roy took it because he did not dare not to. And he stumbled out the door, and the bell rang cheerful behind him. And through the window they all watched him get in his truck and sit there for a second with his hands on the wheel. A big man made small. And then he pulled out onto the highway and drove west, and Two Rivers never saw Roy Deacon again. And I will tell you what became of him, because you are wondering. He did not go far at first. He drifted down to a bigger town 2 hours off and got work at a truck stop kitchen, taking orders from a manager half his age. And he was quiet there, they say, quiet and gray and jumpy. A man who flinched at the sound of a motorcycle and would not, for love or money, work a shift that ran past dark. Whatever Bear whispered to him lived in him the rest of his days. He never raised his hand to another soul, not because he had found decency. He never had any, but because the fear that had been put into him that afternoon never once let go of his throat. Some men only understand the one language. Bear had spoken it to him fluently. It is not a happy ending for Roy. But it is a true one, and it is more than he gave anybody. And for a second, back in the diner, nobody said anything. And then old Walt, who had come in for his afternoon coffee right in the middle of all of it, and had been standing frozen by the door the whole time with his hat in his hands, Walt started to clap. Just one old farmer, clapping his big root hands together slow. And then one of the bikers joined him. And then the whole room came apart into noise, laughing, whooping, 30 leather-clad men hollering like it was a wedding. And Delia stood in the middle of it with her hands over her mouth and tears running down her face. And for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since her father died, she laughed. Out loud. A real one. And Bear looked over at her and grinned through his gray beard and said, "There it is. There's your daddy's laugh." They did not leave right away. That is the part that gets me every time. You would think men like that, they do the job, they get on the bikes, they thunder off into legend. They did not. They stayed. Delia, without even thinking about it, out of 3 years of habit and 30 years of raising, said, "Y'all want coffee?" And the whole club roared yes. And she went behind that counter, her counter now, and she poured coffee for 30 Hell's Angels, and Bear sat at the counter on Walt's stool, and Walt sat next to him, and the 2 old men got to talking like they had known each other forever. And somebody found the switch, and got the broken neon coffee cup in the window to flicker, and then, for the first time in years, hold steady, burning bright red out into the gray afternoon. And they cooked. A couple of the younger ones went back and figured out the grill and made burgers for everybody, terrible burgers, and it was the best meal Delia ever ate. Bear stayed 3 days. The club stayed with him. They took rooms at the little motel down the highway and they filled it. And by the second day, the whole town of Two Rivers, which had watched a woman get beaten for 3 years and said nothing, came out to see. And the strange thing, the human thing, is that the town was not afraid of them. They were kind, those men. They fixed things. They fixed the diner's back step that had been broken for a year. They patched the roof of the little house. They rehung the door of the room over the storage so it did not stick in the cold. Two of them who knew engines got Delia's dead car running, the one that had sat in the lot since the day she arrived, a symbol of being stuck, and now it turned over and ran clean. They would not take a dime for any of it. And here is a thing the town did not expect, a thing that shamed some of them and healed something in others. Those men, over 3 days, were gentle with the very people who had spent 3 years looking at the floor. They did not shame Walt. They did not shame the truckers. They just sat with them and drank coffee, and one evening Bear told the whole diner, quiet, about Cannon, about the fire, about the promise. And by the end of it there were grown men in that room, farmers, drivers, an old widower, wiping their eyes and understanding, each in his own private way, the exact size of the thing they had failed to do. Nobody scolded them. They scolded themselves. And that, it turned out, was what finally moved that town. Not fear of the bikers. Shame in front of their kindness. Two Rivers was a better town after those 3 days than it had been in 50 years, and it stayed that way, and hardly anyone could have told you exactly why. And Bear sat with Delia the last morning before they rode out. Just the two of them, in the corner booth in the early light. And he took her hands in his big scarred ones. And he said, "Now you listen. This is yours now. Free and clear. Nobody owns a piece of you, not ever again, you hear me? And that number in your wallet." She started to cry again. "That number works forever," he said. "Day or night. You call it if the roof leaks. You call it if you're lonesome. You call it for nothing at all. Your daddy didn't leave you alone in this world, baby girl. He just left you for a while, till you were ready to remember you got family." And she nodded, and she could not speak, and he pulled her in and held her one more time. And then he said, quieter, "One more thing. That young girl you told me about. June. You keep an eye out for her kind. The ones that come in scared with a bag. You know what that looks like now from the other side. You take care of them the way somebody should have taken care of you sooner. That's how you pay your daddy back. Not to me. To them." And Delia said she would. And she meant it. And you will see in a minute exactly how much she meant it. Then they rode out. All 30 of them in the clean morning, that thunder rolling back down the valley the way it had come, fading slow, and Delia stood in the gravel lot she owned now and watched until the last of it was gone under the wind, and there was only the small, ordinary sound of birds and the highway. And you would think that would be a sad moment. It was not. She stood there a while. And then she went back inside, and she flipped the sign to open, and Walt was already sitting at the counter waiting, and she said, "Coffee, Walt." Toast almost burnt, and he said, "You got it, hun," and it was the same words as 10,000 mornings before, but everything under them had changed. She kept the diner. Of course she kept it. She ran it for years, and it did well, because people drive a long way for a place that feels safe, and hers did. She hired other women, women who came in with that same quiet, careful look Delia used to have, women with a suitcase and a dead car and nowhere to go, and she gave them work and a room upstairs, and she never charged one of them a dime of rent, and she watched them slowly, week by week, stand up a little straighter. She had a scrap of paper in her wallet with a number on it, soft as cloth, and every one of those women knew that if anybody ever laid a hand on them under that roof, the woman who owned it could make thunder come up the valley. And I will tell you something that will make you glad. June came back. 2 years on, a greyhound let her off at the edge of town, older, harder, alone again, the bad boyfriend finally gone for good, and she walked into that diner not knowing what she would find. And she found Delia, who owned the place now, who came around the counter and folded her up without a word. And Delia gave her the best room upstairs and a job, and over a slow winter, gave her back the thing Roy had nearly taken, which was the belief that she was worth protecting. June never left again. She was still there, running the grill the day this story ends. Bear had been right. That was how you paid it back. Not to him. To them. And here is the last thing. Here is where I leave you. Years later, a man came into that diner, a big loud man, the kind who fills a room the wrong way, and he snapped his fingers at the girl behind the counter and called her a name he had no right to call her, over an order that came out wrong. And that girl froze the way they always freeze. But before she could bend down and pick up the pieces and stare at the floor, a woman came out from the back. Older now, gray coming into her hair, calm as still water. And she walked up to that man, and she did not raise her voice. She just leaned in, close, the way somebody had once leaned in close to Roy Deacon in that very booth, and she said something quiet that nobody else could hear. And that big loud man went pale, and he stood up, and he left money on the table, too much of it, and he walked out and did not come back. And the girl behind the counter stared at her, amazed, and asked her what on earth she had said. And Delia picked up the coffee pot and started her rounds, and she smiled a little, the way her father used to, and she said, "I told him I've got family. Now go on. Table 4 needs a refill." And the red neon coffee cup burned steady in the window, and the counter was clean, and nobody, not ever